Welcome back to the Ruy Lopez Masterclass. In today's chapter, we are talking about a rare move, but nonetheless one that you should know, which is this one here. On the third move, black playing g6, entering what is known as the Smyslov or the fianchetto variation. Now, black's intention here is not very hidden. They want to fianchetto their bishop to g7 and claim that by moving the knight then to e7, they are quick to strike with f5, they have a very solid setup close to their king side, and it's hard for white to crack it. And I think this is true, if not for our strategy, which is going to be to immediately play a very aggressive move, c3, intending on playing d4 next. This is very consistent with all of the other sidelines that we've looked at so far and that we will continue to look at in future episodes. We want to strike with d4, and black now has a decision to make. Now, there are four moves that I'm going to look at, but a lot of them are going to transpose, and you're not actually going to have to memorize four distinct lines of theory here. There's really only a couple. So a6, first of all, has no independent value. We'll take a look at this in a second. We're playing bishop a4, and then black still has to make a decision that's going to impact the course of the game, but throwing in a6 and bishop a4 has little impact. The move d6 is independent, so we're going to actually start by looking at this. It's not the most common, but the idea for black is very simply to play bishop d7 to free the knight so it defends the pawn, and also to play bishop g7 and further defend the pawn. And their intention is that once we play d4, this pawn on e5 is going to be so well defended that they're not going to have to be forced to give us a strong center, which they would have to do if in this position they only focused on developing. Now, this is a main line, which is only developing here, and we're going to look at this later in the video, but d6 is an interesting try. So let's start with this one. We're playing d4, of course, and like I said, they're not going to take, but they're going to maintain the tension. So what do? Well, we start by just developing. We're going to castle, but ultimately, after we get our rook into the game, we're going to strike with d5. If they aren't going to take us, we're going to give them a couple moments to do so and make some healthy developing moves, but ultimately, we're happy with transforming the game into this pawn structure. After d5, their knight is sent backwards, and now we can trade the bishops, and that was a good trade for us because with the pawns and the light squares, our bishop on the light square is not very strong, and our bishop that will sit on e3 is going to be very strong. And from this position, I argue that simply the center control that we have, our good placed bishop, and our good easy development and quick queenside play, much like you would see in the King's Indian defense, gives white a promising middle game. Now, black is going to eventually want to play for f5, but that comes with a whole host of problems, namely weakening the e6 square. So let's see how this could progress. After c4 here, they could indeed play f5 in this position, but like I said, the knight hops around and is a very menacing piece, and it's difficult for black to deal with this. So for example, they're going to have to give up the exchange here just to get rid of that powerful knight in the center. There is a game that we are following here, but probably no surprise to anyone that white ended up converting this position up material very shortly. So that is one of our ideas. If they try to engage in their normal plan of playing f5, we are quick to strike with knight g5, and we are noting sort of the weird placed knights that is atypical in the King's Indian defense. And if they don't do this, let's say they play h6, guarding this square, and maybe later they even want to omit playing f5 in total and go for maybe c6 or c5, well, we are always happy to chop that pawn off and transform into sort of a Morozzi bind situation in the center, where again, I think that white has a pretty pleasant game. So once again, we'll follow a game example just to give you a sense of idea of how these pieces could come into the game. You see the rooks having a very nice time on the open files, the queen comes to f3, the knights maneuver around the light squares, and the holes on d5 and b5 are very telling. And we get to this position here, and white engaged in a very ambitious move here, knight takes c5. It wasn't the best. Okay, they had a point to it, which is that their queenside pawns sort of begin to come into the game, but the sad truth is the pawns are too slow, and it's actually the d pawn for black that's going to be the strongest piece on the board, and you can see very soon after d3 here, white resigned. So the end result was not good, but from this position here, white has a wonderful position. First of all, the clogging of the pawn on d5, perhaps you can consider taking with the rook in these situations and maintain pressure over d6. Taking with the pawn does loosen a little bit your control over potential weak squares. But nonetheless, I really like white's position here, if not for knight takes c5. a4 was the correct way to play. So bishop d2 to a5 is a very difficult threat to stop, and white can continue to play sort of around the light square. As you can imagine, if this knight ever comes to b5, that would be a strong square as well. I think white has a very fine game here. So that's sort of the way that you play in these systems where black never takes the pawn and they focus on quick development and very solid development. We push with d5, we transform into, I think, a good King's Indian defense setup. So now we're taking a look at their other options, which is dealing with this developing issue. So they can start with bishop g7. This is fine, but it's just going to transpose. So we're going to start by moving their knight to e7. We play d4, and here, because they didn't play with the system of d6, they're no longer able to maintain the tension they have to take. And now black can either play bishop g7, transposing to the move order starting with bishop g7, or what we're going to start by looking at is this move d5. And this is the added flexibility of first starting with developing the knight. You're able to strike instantly, and my recommendation is to take here. And this transformation is very interesting. On one hand, we have a weak center pawn, but on the other hand, we're going to chop off the knight on c6 very soon and give them weak pawns on the c file. And it becomes a very interesting strategical battle based on these weaknesses. So we also don't have the bishop pair. So very interesting imbalances, and I think this gives white a good chance to play for the full point. So once you put a major piece on the c file, these pawns are going to feel a lot of tension, and either they're going to have to eventually sacrifice one, maybe by playing c5, otherwise we're going to clog that hole with our knight, which is going to be a very strong piece here sitting on the outpost, and as long as the pawn in the center is well defended, it gives us a lot of very critical squares like c5 that you see on the screen now. So we are again following a game. I like to show these games very liberally because I think it gives you a sense of how you can maneuver your pieces. So we start by a little bit of theory in this video, just showing the basic ideas in the opening, but then to show you how the pieces come to life, how the ideas really begin to generate. We kind of spam these example games, and you can see that I think it's really this pawn that ends up giving white all of their maneuvering power here, right? These knight simply jumping around, using the pawn to cave out some squares, and it's black who is missing a center pawn. We are a little bit behind in development as white, so soon we should look to certainly move the queen out and be able to start developing the rook that hasn't moved yet. But once we do that, the extra material and the otherwise strong position gave white a pretty dominant transition to an endgame, and indeed they ended up converting, and here black resigned. So okay, the endgame not so important, but I think this very close middle game, this early middle game here, was useful to see, where we double their pawns and then we play using this knight to kind of maneuver around. I think the c5 square is one of the most critical ones in these setups. So that is them electing to play with this d5 move after knight g to e7. They can also play bishop g7, and this is maybe the most classical way to play, simply focusing on development. And here we strike with d5, noting that they have missed their opportunity to do so from the black side. And we enter this transformation here, where very soon, especially if they delay castling, f4 is going to hit them, right? If they play a6, we can simply play f4 here. If they instead play c6, hitting our bishop the other way, we can play f4. They can castle, and we can delay f4, but at some point it's always something black has to worry about, and here it comes. And I think once we get f4, it's this extra against center, and I think this is a common theme because g6 on the third move really takes away black's ability to have good center control, and we're taking advantage of that via our c3 d4 maneuver, and you see this as a common theme in this video. So f4 comes, and it's very strong here, very difficult for black to deal with our center. And always they have to worry about, are we getting in with e5 even further? Are we getting in with f5 even further and going for a very quick attack on the king side? In this particular game that I'm showing, it was indeed a center break that ended up being very strong. This move e5 here comes. and the entire position explodes, and all of white's pieces are well placed to open up the center. And again, it's such a passive position for black, right? Just look at how their pieces are placed here. Yeah, very difficult position. Eventually they took, but then the king for the black side ended up feeling very vulnerable. The rooks infiltrated. Okay, it doesn't take much to see that it is white who is winning here. Okay, you do have to notice that you're going to win the bishop as well, but once you do, this endgame should be convertible, and white did so in pretty convincing style. So that is these lines where they don't play for d5, they really surrender the center, and they, more than that, give us this ability to always play for f4, and that's sort of my key recommendation. And I think this now takes us actually to this move, a6. I think this is the final move we haven't talked about. We've looked at what happens if they try to bolster their center and not take. We're playing d5, transforming to a King's Indian defense. We've looked at what happens if they focus on developing and they do strike, where we trade, take on c6, and claim that the weaknesses on the c-file give us a fine game. And we've also looked at, finally, what happens if they simply focus on developing and they don't strike, and again, the center which they surrender ends up being very useful for us. But what about a6? Very flexible move. They haven't committed anything, but we do the same. We play bishop a4, and we haven't committed anything. And here, the same question arises. What do they do? And so specifically, after they develop the knight, we go d4, and guys, there's no transpositional difference. If they play d5, we take, and we're soon going to take on c6. The fact that the pawn is on a6 here is completely irrelevant, right? We're going for the same sort of plan. If anything, the pawn on a6 could even be an added weakness that we could target. They could also play the other system with bishop g7, but once again, we're going for the same lines where f4 is coming faster than black would like, and I think white gets generally a fine middle game. That's all I think you need to know. Very basic, not too much hard theory, but more so the idea of using our center effectively as it relates to the different setups that black can elect to play. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you are new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.